There are men who measure their lives in the things they keep running. Warren Dellacroix was one of them. And on a Tuesday morning in November, in a barn at the edge of the Skagit Valley, a decision was coming that would cost him everything he had left, or prove that some things were never meant to be sold. If the quiet stories of men who refuse to quit are why you come here, subscribe now. Because this one doesn't let go. The barn door needed lifting at the bottom before it would swing. Warren had known this for 11 years and had never fixed it. Some things you just learn to work with. He got both hands under the rotting wood crosspiece and heaved, felt the familiar grind of metal on frozen earth, and the door swung open into the November dark. Cold came in like a guest who didn't wait to be invited. At 5:15 in the morning, the Skagit Valley was still black, the kind of black that sits in the lungs, and the single work light Warren clicked on through one pale circle across the concrete floor. She was there. She was always there. The diamond T969 filled the barn the way a ship fills a dry dock, not because it was impossibly large, but because it had a presence that made everything around it seem temporary. The cab was square and high military bone structure, still wearing traces of the olive drab it had come home in under 3 coats of faded black. The boom rose behind the cab like a cathedral spire, heavy steel I-beams welded at angles that engineers had calculated not for aesthetics, but for the specific task of pulling 30-ton Sherman tanks out of Italian mud. The winch drum was the size of a dining table. The tires stood nearly as tall as Warren himself. He put one hand flat on the hood. The metal was cold enough to sting. "Morning, old girl." He did not feel foolish saying this. He had been saying it for 52 years. Warren Dellacroix was 78 years old, and he had the hands to prove it, knuckled and rope-scarred, the kind of hands that younger men sometimes stared at without meaning to. His face had been weathered into something that no longer looked old, so much as permanent, like the face of a mountain that has simply been there long enough to stop apologizing for the weather. He walked with a slight forward lean that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with 40 years of walking uphill. He had been awake since 4. This was not unusual. Since Ruth died 4 in the morning was just when the house got too quiet to stay in. He moved around the diamond T the way a man moves around something he knows better than himself. Touching a bolt here, checking the cable tension there, not because anything needed checking, but because the ritual of it settled something in his chest. He checked the oil. He checked the hydraulic fluid on the winch. He crouched down at the rear tandem and pressed his thumb against the tire and felt the resistance push back solid and cold and real. His father had done this same walk every morning for 29 years. Émile Dellacroix had come to Washington State from Louisiana in 1938, following timber work north the way water follows a slope, inevitably without drama. He had been a big man with a carpenter's precision and a Cajun's patience, and when the army started selling off its surplus equipment in 1946, he had driven to a depot outside Tacoma with $1,400 in a coffee can and come home with this machine. His neighbors had thought he was either a genius or a fool. Over the next 3 decades, the answer had become clear enough that no one brought it up anymore. Émile had called her La Bête, the beast. He'd said it with the particular tenderness that some men reserve for things that have never let them down. Warren straightened up from the tire and reached inside the collar of his flannel shirt. The chain was there, it was always there, a simple ball-chain military issue, the kind that used to hold dog tags. On it hung a single key, not a modern key, not a copy. The original ignition key for the Diamond T stamped with a government contract number that had not been relevant since 1947. The metal was worn smooth on one side from decades of being held. A strip of leather cord, frayed to a single thread at one end, was still looped through the keyring, all that remained of the lanyard Emile had tied on the day he brought the machine home. Warren looked at it for a moment in the pale light. Then he tucked it back inside his shirt against his chest, where it had lived for 53 years. He went inside to make coffee. The kitchen was the warmest room in the house and the most honest. The counters showed use. The table had a coffee ring that had been there so long it had become part of the wood. On the wall beside the refrigerator, Ruth had hung a photograph of the two of them on their wedding day in 1969, and Warren had not moved it and did not plan to. She was laughing in it, which was accurate. She had laughed at most things, including him, and he had been the better for it. He poured his coffee and stood at the window that looked out toward the barn. The work light was still on inside, throwing a faint yellow seam under the door. From here, if you didn't look carefully, you might have thought someone else was in there working. He had thought this more than once in the last 4 years. He drank his coffee and did not think about the date, even though some part of him knew it was the anniversary of the first freeze that had taken Ruth's car off Route 20 and into the guardrail and ultimately into the hospital and ultimately into the silence that had settled over this house like 3 feet of snow and never entirely melted. He did not think about it because there was no useful direction that thinking led. He thought instead about the hydraulic line on the winch that had shown a hairline of seepage last month, and whether it needed replacing or just monitoring, and decided monitoring for another 2 weeks before committing to a repair. This was how Warren Dellacroix managed the interior weather of his life. He found something concrete and attended to it. The phone rang at 7:42. He let it ring twice. He always let it ring twice, then picked it up. Warren, not a question. Lena Burkhart had been the Skagit County Sheriff for 14 years, and before that, a deputy for 9, and before that, a girl who had grown up 3 farms over and stolen apples from his mother's tree in 1973. She had never once called him without knowing exactly what she needed to say. Lena, you hear about the situation up on the Cascade Access Road, the dam project. Heard something on the scanner last night. Caterpillar went off the road. 395 series, $800,000 of it is sitting on a 35-degree slope in last night's mud. 2 recovery outfits out of Bellingham already looked and walked. Grounds too soft, grades too steep, access roads too narrow for outrigger deployment. Warren was quiet. Outside, the first gray light was beginning to separate the ridgeline from the sky. Why are you telling me this, Lena? It was not a question either. Because I've known you 50 years, Warren, and I know what you're thinking right now, and I thought you deserved to hear it from someone who isn't going to try to talk you out of anything. A pause. They say nobody can do it. Thought you'd want to know that. The line was quiet for a moment. I'll call you back, Warren said. He hung up. He stood at the window for a long time, looking at the faint seam of light under the barn door. Then he heard tires on the gravel. He knew the sound of his son's car. A rental, always a rental. Cole, having decided at some point in his 40s that owning a car in Seattle was a form of irrational optimism, and he turned from the window and poured a second cup of coffee before Cole was even on the porch. The door opened. Cole Dellacroix was 52 years old and had inherited his mother's face and his grandfather's height and his father's habit of getting straight to whatever needed to be said. He was wearing a jacket that was not warm enough for the valley in November, which was a thing that happened every time he visited, and that Warren had stopped mentioning. "Dad, coffee's ready." Cole came in and set a manila folder on the kitchen table next to Warren's cup. He did not sit down. He put both hands in his jacket pockets and looked at his father with an expression that was trying to be practical and not entirely succeeding. Warren looked at the folder. He did not touch it. "What is this?" "It's an offer from a dealer in Yakima. Equipment collector, really. He specializes in this era 40s, 50s military surplus. He knows what she is." Cole's voice was careful, measured, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this on the drive up and was now finding that the rehearsal hadn't quite prepared him for the kitchen. $47,000, Dad. That's a real number. That's the roof, it's the medical bills, it's 3 years of not worrying. Warren's hand moved to his chest without his deciding to, rested there flat over the key beneath his shirt. "Who told you about the medical bills?" "Dr. Haverford's office called me in September. They weren't supposed to, but they knew you wouldn't." Cole stopped, tried a different direction. "You're 78 years old. You live alone on 40 acres. The truck hasn't moved in 2 years. I start her twice a year. Starting her isn't using her. It's maintaining her." Warren's voice was level. "Different thing." Cole looked at the ceiling briefly, then back. "Dad, Grandpa Emile bought that machine so he could work. He used it until it wasn't practical anymore. This is the same thing. The work's done. The collector will put her in a climate-controlled building and take care of her properly, and she'll outlast both of us." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Then Warren picked up his coffee cup and walked to the window again. From here he could see the barn, the pale morning light beginning to show the outline of the door, the line of old-growth Doug fir at the property edge that had been there when his father first broke ground. He could see, if he looked at the right angle, the slight indentation in the dirt where the Diamond T had sat for so many years that the ground had shaped itself around her weight. "Leave the folder," he said. "I'll look at it." This was not a yes. Cole understood that it was also not quite a no, which was further than he had expected to get. He nodded once, poured himself a coffee, and sat down. They did not talk about the folder. They talked about Cole's daughter Petra, who was studying civil engineering at Oregon State, which Warren found quietly satisfying without saying so. They talked about the fence line on the north pasture. They talked about whether the winter would come early. At 8:15, Warren's phone rang again. He looked at the number, not Lena this time, a number he didn't know, Skagit area code. He picked it up. "Mr. Dellacroix, my name is Mira Osgood. I'm the site supervisor for the Cascade Valley Dam project. I got your number from Sheriff Burkhart." The voice was professional and clipped, and underneath the clip there was something that had been up all night. "I understand you have a Diamond T969. "That's right. We have a situation on the access road at mile marker 7. I've had 2 recovery companies on site, and both have declined to attempt the extraction. The terrain is—" She paused. "I'm told you know this ground." 35-degree slope, Warren said. "Soft base from last night's rain. Access roads what 18 feet wide at the turn." A brief silence. 16 feet at the turn, yes. "How did you—" "I logged that drainage for 6 years in the 70s. The road's built overfill. It'll compress under outrigger load. He paused. That's why the other companies walked. That is why, Mira said. Warren looked at the manila folder on his kitchen table. He looked at the barn. I'll be there at 10, he said. He hung up. Cole set his coffee cup down. Dad, the recovery work. I heard. Cole stood up. Dad, you can't. I can. Your back is fine. Your back is not fine, the doctor said. The doctor said limit heavy lifting. I'm not lifting anything. The machine does the lifting. You're 78 years old and you want to take a 1946 military wrecker up a mountain access road in November mud. November mud is the job. Warren was already moving toward the back hall, toward his canvas work jacket on the hook by the door. That's when things go wrong. That's when the work matters. Dad, Cole's voice had lost the careful, measured quality. There was something underneath it now, something raw. Mom's gone. If something happens to you up there... He stopped, swallowed, tried again. I don't have anybody left. Warren stopped. The hallway was narrow and low-ceilinged and full of the particular smell of old houses, wood and oil and decades. He stood with his back to his son for a long moment. Then he reached inside his shirt. He pulled out the chain, worked the key off it with deliberate fingers. The metal was warm from being against his skin. He turned around and held it out, the small worn key, the single frayed thread of leather still looped through the ring, the government contract number stamped into its face, worn nearly invisible now. Cole looked at it. His father's face was not angry, and it was not dismissive. It was the face of a man who understood exactly what was being said, and was choosing with full knowledge his answer. Your grandfather put this in my hand in 1971, Warren said. He was standing right here, more or less. He just found out his heart was going. He looked at the key for a moment, then at Cole. He didn't ask me to be careful. He didn't tell me what the machine was worth or who might want to buy it. A pause. He said, she knows the hard roads. So do you. Cole was quiet. Warren placed the key back in his son's palm. Let him hold it for 3 seconds, then took it back. I know, son, he said. He put the chain back over his head, settled the key against his chest, and pulled on his canvas jacket. The diamond T started on the 3rd crank. There was the cough, there was always the cough, a deep mechanical clearing of the throat that Emile had called her morning complaint, and then the engine caught and settled into its low, grinding idle that Warren felt as much as heard a vibration that came up through the floorboards and the seat and into his bones like a tuning fork finding a frequency it recognized. The cab had no doors. It had never had doors. This was standard military configuration, easier egress in combat conditions, as if the men who designed it had already accepted that the terrain might require a fast exit. The windshield was flat glass in a square steel frame. The heater was aspirational at best. At 29 degrees outside, Warren could see his breath in small, steady clouds. He did not mind. He had never minded. He drove the Diamond T down the farm track and out onto County Road 9 at 8:50, and the sound of her low grinding, purposeful, a sound like something that had already made up its mind, carried across the flat valley fields in the still November air. A red-tailed hawk lifted off a fence post as he passed. A pickup coming the other direction slowed, and the driver, a man Warren didn't recognize, just stared. Warren drove at 17 miles an hour, which was the Diamond T's comfortable road speed and always had been. Cole's rental car appeared in the side mirror a quarter-mile back. Warren had known Cole would follow. Cole had always followed when it mattered, even when he didn't want to. He drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on his thigh, and watched the valley give way to the first foothills, and the foothills begin to rise toward the Cascades. The dug fir closed in on both sides of the road, dark green going to black in the shadow, and the pavement narrowed, and the grade began, and the Diamond T shifted into herself the way working equipment does. When the work begins, something in the sound changed, something in the feel of it, a deepening of purpose. Warren reached inside his jacket, pressed his hand flat against the chain, against the key. He did not do this consciously. He had been doing it every time the road got hard for 53 years. The Cascade Access Road at mile marker 7 was a 16-foot cut into the mountainside, barely wide enough for construction traffic, its shoulder dropping away sharply on the downhill side into a drainage that was currently running fast and muddy from the night's rain. The road surface was compacted gravel over fill, and last night had done what November does to fill, softened it, made it remember. It was just moved earth, pretending to be solid. The Caterpillar 395 was not a small machine. Sitting tilted at 35 degrees on the slope below the road, its near track in the drainage ditch and its far side raised into the air, it looked less like a piece of equipment and more like a beached thing, something that had tried to go where it shouldn't and knew it. The operator, a young man named Garrett, was standing on the road above it with his hands in his pockets and the specific expression of someone who has accepted that today is a bad day and is now just waiting to find out how bad. 2 Bellingham recovery rigs were parked at the widest point of the road, their crews leaning against fenders and drinking coffee from thermoses. They had the relaxed posture of men who had already made their decision and were now just present for the conclusion. Mira Osgood stood at the edge of the road above the stuck machine, tablet in hand, and she turned when she heard the Diamond T coming up the grade. Warren watched her face go through 3 things in 3 seconds: recognition of what she was seeing, recalibration of what she'd expected, and a decision to withhold judgment. That third thing told him something about her. Behind her, a younger man, late 20s, safety vest clipboard, turned and looked and did not withhold his judgment at all. He leaned over to say something to the man next to him, and they both smiled. Warren had seen this before. He had seen it many times before. The smile was not malicious. It was the smile of people who had learned their certainty somewhere and not yet had it educated out of them. Warren parked the Diamond T and climbed down. At 78, getting out of the cab was a matter of patience rather than agility. He took the step, then the ground, and stood straight and looked at the slope. He did not look at the people. He looked at the slope. The slope told him things. The way the mud had flowed in the drainage told him about the composition of the fill underneath. The angle of the caterpillar's tilt told him about the point of failure, and therefore about where the firm ground was. The color of the exposed soil on the cut bank told him about moisture content. The run of water down the tire track on the road surface told him about drainage patterns. He walked to the edge, crouched down, pressed 2 fingers into the mud at the road margin, and felt the resistance, or the lack of it, and then pressed further and felt where the resistance began. 14 inches down. The feel was soft for 14 inches, then there was something compacted underneath. He stood up. The young man with the clipboard had walked over. Up close, he had the face of someone who was excellent at school and had not yet entirely recovered from this. Dusty Kraus, he said, structural recovery consultant, Pacific Crest Equipment. He held out a hand. Warren shook it. Warren Dellacroix. Mr. Dellacroix. Kraus opened his clipboard to a printed sheet dense with calculations, load vectors, gradient formulas. I've actually run the numbers on this recovery already. Force required to shift the 395 on a 35-degree grade, given its weight and the current soil-bearing capacity, you're looking at a pull rating of approximately 93,000 foot-pounds. He indicated the diamond T with a glance that attempted to be respectful and mostly succeeded. The T-Series winch rating for that generation is 78,000 foot-pounds at capacity. You're about 18% short. The physics don't support it. Warren looked at him. What angle did you calculate the pull from? He asked. Kraus looked at his sheet. Standard approach angle, road level anchor 45 degrees to the stuck unit. What if the anchor isn't at road level? A pause. The road is the only... There are 3 Douglas fir at the upper bend, 80, maybe 90 years old, root systems down 8 feet minimum. Warren looked back at the slope. If I run the cable upslope through a 3-point snatch block system with a primary anchor at elevation, I'm not pulling at 45 degrees. I'm pulling at 62. He paused. Your calculation changes. Kraus was quiet. He looked at his sheet. He looked at the slope. He looked back at his sheet. Something shifted in his face. Not defeat, but the specific expression of a person whose certainty has just met a wall it didn't know was there and is now cautiously feeling around for the door. I'd need to recalculate, he said. Take your time, Warren said. He went back to the diamond T and began pulling cable. He worked for 2 hours and 20 minutes. He did not explain what he was doing. He had never been a man who narrated his work. Emile had taught him that working and talking were not the same activity, and that trying to do both usually produced less of each. He assessed, he moved, he rigged. He walked the slope twice more, each time pressing his fingers into the ground at different points, reading the soil, the way a doctor reads a patient with attention and without assumptions. The snatch block system went in first. 3 anchor points, the largest Doug fir at the upper bend, a secondary tree 12 feet lower and offset left, and a tertiary anchor using the diamond T's own rear frame cross-bolted to a dead man he cut from a section of the access road's drainage log. The geometry of the system, once assembled, looked nothing like standard recovery rigging. It looked instead like something that had been designed specifically for this slope, this soil, this machine. Because it had. Mira Osgood had stopped typing on her tablet sometime around the 40-minute mark. She was writing in a small paper notebook instead, standing at the road edge, watching with the focused attention of someone learning something. The 2 Bellingham crews had put away their thermoses. Garrett, the Caterpillar's operator, had sat down on the road with his back against the cut bank and his eyes on Warren. Cole had parked the rental car at the widest point of the road and was standing behind it with his arms folded and his jaw set and his eyes following every movement his father made. Warren did not acknowledge any of them. He was reading the mountain. The mountain was still talking if you knew how to listen. He was nearly finished rigging when Mira Osgood came to stand beside him. Mr. Dellacroix, she had a sheaf of papers. Before you begin the extraction, I need you to sign the liability waiver. It's standard for unaffiliated recovery personnel. She paused. I'm sorry, my legal team requires it. Warren took the papers. He read them. He was not a man who signed things without reading them, and he was not a man who read things without understanding them, And so he stood on the muddy access road in the November cold for 6 minutes and read 4 pages of legal language with the same attention he had given the slope. He got to the last page. He read it again. Section 14, paragraph C. All equipment utilized in the recovery operation described herein may be subject to retention and mechanical inspection by Pacific Crest Equipment LLC for a period not to exceed 90 days following completion of operation at the company's discretion. He looked up. He looked at the diamond T. He understood that this was not a trap. It was boilerplate, the kind of language legal departments insert as a matter of policy without considering that the equipment in question might be irreplaceable, might be a 1946 military wrecker that was the last material evidence of a man's entire inheritance, might be the only thing in his life that still felt like a conversation with someone he missed every day. He stood with the papers in his hand for a long time. A slight wind came up the drainage, carrying the smell of cold water and wet pine. His hand moved to his chest. He felt the key there, the small hard edge of it, the warmth it had taken from his skin. He thought about the caterpillar on the slope, about Garrett, who had a name and presumably a family, and a bad day that didn't need to get worse, about the fact that there was a machine stuck on a hard road, and he was the only person here who knew how to move it. His father had never needed much reason beyond that. Warren signed the papers. He handed them back to Mira without comment, turned and climbed into the cab. The key went in. The engine coughed. And then it caught. The winch drum began to turn. Not quickly, not with any drama. It turned the way a tide turns, with a patience that had nothing to prove and no interest in spectacle. The cable, military specification, thicker than anything the Bellingham crews had brought on their rigs, drew taut through the first snatch block, then the second, the geometry of the system, pulling the line to an angle that Dusty Kraus was still staring at, with his pencil moving across his recalculated sheet. Warren sat in the open cab and watched the cable. You watch the cable. You do not watch the stuck machine, not yet. The cable tells you everything, the way it vibrates, tells you about load distribution, the way it moves, tells you whether your anchor points are holding, the way it goes from slack to taut, tells you whether the ground underneath is doing what you asked it to do. Emile had taught him this when he was 16, sitting in this same seat, and it was still true. The first anchor held, the second held, the deadman at the rear of the Diamond T took the counterload without movement. Warren gave the winch another quarter throttle. The cable sang a low, tight note barely audible, the sound of 80,000 pounds of potential energy finding its geometry. Nothing happened to the caterpillar. For 40 seconds nothing happened at all. Then the mud at the machines near track made a sound like a held breath releasing, and the caterpillar shifted. Not much. 3 inches, maybe 4, the far side dropping slightly as weight redistributed off the high track and onto the low one. Just enough to change the physics, just enough to matter. Mira Osgood wrote something in her notebook. Warren held the tension exactly where it was. This was the part that could not be taught from a manual, knowing when to hold and when to push, knowing that a load under tension needs time to find its new equilibrium before you ask it to move again. Modern operators pushed through this moment. They had hydraulic systems capable of generating force faster than the ground could respond, and so they pushed, and sometimes it worked, and sometimes it turned a recoverable situation into a write-off. Emile had called it impatience du métal, the impatience of metal, wanting the machine to do what you want it to do right now, instead of what the ground is willing to allow. Warren waited 30 seconds. Then he gave the winch one more quarter turn. The caterpillar moved 8 inches up the slope. Behind Warren, somebody exhaled. He didn't turn to see who. It took 47 minutes. Later, people would talk about those 47 minutes in ways that made them sound like something different from what they were. They would use words like miraculous and unbelievable, and you had to see it, and Warren understood why people talked that way, because it was easier than describing what it actually was, which was knowledge applied with patience, in the right sequence, in the right place. The kind of thing that looks impossible only if you've never watched someone who has been doing it for 50 years. Pull, hold, let settle. Pull, hold, let settle. The diamond T never strained. It never protested. It worked at the pace the slope allowed, sometimes a few inches per pull, sometimes closer to a foot, once a remarkable 18 inches, when a pocket of firm ground caught the track at exactly the right moment, and the whole machine seemed to decide to cooperate. The engine sat at a steady low idle throughout. The boom flexed within its design tolerances. The cable never lost its tone. At the 20-minute mark, the caterpillar's near track found purchase on a shelf of consolidated gravel below the fill. At 31 minutes, the machine leveled enough that Garrett, standing above on the road, put both hands over his mouth. At 42 minutes, the high track came down, and all 4 contact points were on slope instead of 2 on slope and 2 on air. At 47 minutes, the Caterpillar 395 rolled onto the excess road under its own power and stopped. Garrett stood next to it with his hand on the track housing and did not move for a long moment. The Bellingham crews were not leaning on their fenders anymore. They were standing at the road edge, and one of them, older man, gray at the temples, was nodding slowly, the way you nod when something confirms what you suspected about the world rather than overturning it. Dusty Krause had his clipboard at his side. His pencil was behind his ear. He was looking at the diamond T with an expression Warren had seen before on different faces in different decades, the expression of a person in the process of revising something they thought they knew. Mira Osgood closed her notebook. She looked at Warren as he shut down the winch, set the brake, and sat for a moment in the open cab, with his hands on his knees, letting the morning settle. Then she walked to the cab. "Mr. Dellacroix," she looked up at him. "That was—" She stopped, started again. "I don't have a word for that." "Recovery," Warren said. "That's the word." He climbed down. He began breaking down the rigging alone. This was always how he finished, the same methodical patience. In reverse cable, respooled snatch blocks, unshackled anchor points cleared. Cole had come forward from behind the rental car and stood at a respectful distance, and then, without being asked, picked up the end of the cable and began feeding it back onto the drum the way Warren liked it fed, which was right to left in tight coils, which was how Emile had always done it, which Cole had seen done enough times at enough moments of his childhood that his hands knew it without instruction. Warren watched his son's hands for a moment, said nothing. They worked in silence, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was, in fact, the best conversation they'd had in years. Dusty Krause appeared at Warren's shoulder when the second snatch block came down. He was not carrying his clipboard. "Can I ask you something?" Warren unshackled the block, inspected the shackle pin, set it in the rigging box. Go ahead. When you said I calculated the angle wrong, Kraus paused. You knew that before you looked at my sheet. How? Warren considered this. The road's on fill over drainage, he said. Fill settles toward the drainage. Your anchor point would have migrated down slope, under load, maybe 2-3 degrees over the first 10 minutes of tension. Your calculation assumed a static anchor. He picked up the next block. On flat ground, static anchor is fine. On fill over drainage, nothing is static. Kraus was quiet for a moment. That's not in any of the training materials. No, Warren said. It's in the ground. He moved to the Detman anchor and began the excavation to retrieve the log he'd buried. It was slower work. The ground had partially refrozen around it in the November air, and he was crouched in the ditch with a short-handled spade when Kraus crouched down beside him and without comment began loosening the soil on the other side. Warren let him. They dug in silence for a few minutes. How long have you been doing this? Kraus asked. Warren thought about it. 55 years working timber, recovery work for about 40 of that. He worked the spade under the log. My father longer. The machines from the war, built for the war. My father bought it after. Warren got the spade under and levered. He said an army that's done fighting has no further use for the things it built to fight with. He thought that was a shame. Kraus took the other end of the log as it came free. They lifted it out together. It was Cole who found the problem, and the problem was the kind that arrives quietly and stays loud. He was rechecking the cable tension on the drum, running his hand along the top layer of the spool, which was the same habit Warren had when he stopped and turned the drum slowly by hand and stopped again. Dad, something in the word made Warren straighten up from the rigging box. Cole was crouched at the drum, his hand on a section of cable near the drum flange, and his face had the particular expression of a man who has found something he did not want to find. Warren walked over. He crouched down beside his son. The cable had a deformation, not a break, not a kink, but a compression pattern in 3 adjacent strands that indicated the cable had been run over something during the recovery, a rock most likely in the drainage ditch, hidden under the mud. The strands were still integral. The cable had not failed and would not fail on inspection, but the deformation covered about 4 inches of the cable's length, and in those 4 inches the working load limit had been compromised. By how much was a calculation Warren did not need to do mathematically, because he had spent 40 years developing the intuition that replaced the math, and his intuition said not enough for what he'd just done, but possibly enough to matter next time. He looked at the cable for a long moment. He had 2 options. He could pull the cable, replace it, which would cost money he didn't have at a ready moment and time he didn't want to spend. Or he could mark the damaged section, avoid loading it to capacity, and monitor. He had chosen monitoring with the hydraulic line last month. He had chosen monitoring again this morning. He sat back on his heels and looked at the 4 inches of compromised cable and understood that he was in the process of accumulating small decisions that would eventually add up to a large one, and that this was how things broke not in catastrophes, but in the slow addition of small acceptable risks until the acceptable became the unavoidable. He marked the section with a wrap of red tape from his kit. "I'll replace it next week," he said. Cole looked at him, did not say anything about the hydraulic line, did not say anything about the medical bills or the roof or the manila folder sitting on the kitchen table 12 miles away. He just nodded. "Okay," Cole said. They finished the breakdown together. Mira Osgood came back with the paperwork, before Warren had finished loading the last of the rigging onto the Diamond T's flatbed. He saw her coming and knew from the way she was walking, purposeful, with the tablet under her arm and the paper notebook in her hand, that this was not a social call. She handed him an envelope. "Payment for the recovery," she said. "Pacific Crest's standard contractor rate for extraction operations, plus a terrain differential." She paused. "It's $4,200. Warren looked at the envelope. "I didn't discuss a rate." "No, but the work was done, and Pacific Crest isn't in the habit of not paying for work that was done." Something shifted slightly in her manner, not warmth exactly, but a loosening of the professional register. "My company also owes you an apology regarding the liability paperwork. Section 14, paragraph C. I called our legal team this morning while you were rigging. That clause has been removed from your file." She met his eyes. "You signed because you wanted to help. That's not a thing I'm willing to use against you." Warren was quiet for a moment. He took the envelope. "Thank you," he said. He did not say it the way people say thank you when they mean something smaller. Mira nodded, once turned, and went back to her work. Cole, standing at the Diamond T's running board, had heard all of it. He looked at his father with an expression that was trying to say several things at once, and settling for saying nothing, which was, Warren thought, the correct choice. Warren put the envelope in his jacket pocket. He climbed into the cab. He was halfway through his turnaround when Dusty Krause appeared at the cab window. The young man was standing in the road, not blocking, but present the posture of someone who needs to say something and is still working out the architecture of it. Warren put the brake on. He waited. "I told my supervisor the geometry calculation was wrong because of variable anchor migration on field substrate," Krause said. "I didn't tell him you caught it. I told him I caught it on second review." A pause. "That was wrong. I wanted you to know I know that." Warren looked at him. It was a real thing to say. It cost something to say it, and the young man had said it anyway, standing in the cold on a muddy mountain road with nobody around who needed to hear it except Warren. "Why are you telling me?" Warren asked. "Because you didn't correct me in front of everyone when you could have. And Krause stopped, tried again. "I want to understand how you read the slope. I've been doing structural recovery for 5 years, and I don't know how to do what you did today." Warren studied the young man's face. He thought about Emile sitting in this cab in 1962, talking a 20-year-old Warren through the reading of a logging road embankment with the patience of a man who understood that knowledge has to be given away to be worth having. "Come find me when you're off this project," Warren said. "Bring work boots, not those." He looked at Krause's boots, which were technical and waterproof, and not built for the kind of mud that had opinions. "Those won't last an hour in the drainage." Something happened in Krause's face. Not quite relief and not quite gratitude, something more like the particular feeling of a door opening that you hadn't known was closed. "Yes, sir," he said. Warren released the brake. The Diamond T turned slowly and with authority and began its descent. Cole followed. He kept the rental car 200 yards back, which was the distance that said, "I'm here," without saying, "I'm watching you," and Warren saw it in the mirror for the full 12 miles back to the valley. The road came down out of the Cascades and flattened into the agricultural corridor of the Skagit, and the light that had been thin and gray all morning was beginning to take on a little warmth as noon approached, weak November warmth that didn't commit to anything but was better than nothing. A tractor was working a field to the south, turning cover crop under, and Warren watched it move in long straight lines and thought about nothing in particular, which was a thing he had learned to do on long drives in this cab, let the machine's rhythm carry the thinking for a while, let the ground moving under the wheels substitute for intention. He thought about the cable. He thought about the 4 inches of red tape. He thought about the hydraulic line. He thought about Ruth saying, in the last winter, Warren, at some point, the maintenance becomes the message, meaning that there was a difference between keeping something alive and keeping something going, and that sometimes loving a thing meant acknowledging what it needed more than you wanted to give. He had disagreed with her then. He was less sure now. The barn came into view at the end of the farm track, the work light still burning inside from the morning, and Warren pulled the diamond T through the door and set the brake and sat in the cab for a moment in the barn's particular silence, the smell of old oil and cold concrete, and something underneath it, both something that had no name but that he had been breathing all his life. He pulled the chain from his shirt, held the key in his palm. The leather thread was down to almost nothing. Now he could see individual fibers separating at the loop where it passed through the keyring. Another month, maybe 2, and it would let go entirely. He should replace it. He had been meaning to replace it for 3 years. Cole came through the barn door behind him. He stopped when he saw Warren sitting in the cab with the key in his hand, and he did not say anything, and Warren did not say anything, and the barn held them both in its cold and its history. Then Cole walked to the side of the diamond T and put his hand on the hood, the same gesture Warren had made that morning. He left it there. The metal was warm from the engine now. $4,000, Cole said finally. Not an accusation, not even a question, just the number placed in the air between them. Give or take, Warren said. That's not nothing. No. Cole looked at his hand on the hood. I didn't understand something this morning when you left. I thought I did, but I didn't. He paused. When you pulled that machine off the slope, the way those people watched you. Another pause. That's not... He stopped, tried again. I've been thinking about what Grandpa Emile left you. I thought it was the truck. I was wrong about that, wasn't I? Warren looked at his son. What do you think he left? Warren asked. Cole thought about it for a long moment. The knowing, Cole said. He left you the knowing. The barn was very quiet. Outside, a wind had come up the valley from the north, carrying the smell of the approaching winter. The dug fir at the property edge moved in it. The light through the barn door shifted. Warren closed his hand around the key. Yes, he said. He climbed down from the cab. They walked to the house together, and Warren made 2 cups of coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table where the manila folder still lay, and neither of them touched it, and neither of them needed to say why. Cole arrived on Saturday. He came up the farm track in the rental car just after 9, and Warren had coffee ready and the letter from Olympia on the kitchen table beside Petra's card from Oregon State and the seed catalog and the envelope with "No thank you." Not for sale written on the back in Warren's deliberate hand. Cole sat down and read the Heritage Registry letter twice the way the Dellacroix men read things, and then he set it down and looked at his father. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, 31 days ago. That's what it says. He submitted it the day after the recovery. Apparently, Cole looked at the letter again. Outside, the morning was clear and cold, the first hard freeze of the season having come through Thursday night, and the fields were white with it, the kind of white that makes the world look decided. Cole looked out the window at the barn, then back at the letter, then at his father. "What are you going to do?" Cole asked. "About what?" "The nomination, the registry, all of it." Warren picked up his coffee cup. I'm going to write back and say thank you." He paused. "And then I'm going to start her up, because I haven't done it since the recovery, and the hydraulic line needs checking." Cole was quiet for a moment. "The hydraulic line," he said. "The hydraulic line," Warren confirmed. Something moved through Cole's face. Not quite a smile, not quite its opposite. Something that had learned to live between the two. "Okay," he said. He got up and got his own coffee, and they sat together in the kitchen in the morning light and talked about Petra's finals and the north fence and the cover crop on the south field, and Warren noticed that Cole had stopped monitoring the conversation the way he'd been monitoring it for years, watching for signs, checking for tremors, the exhausting vigilance of a son who had decided somewhere along the way that worry was the same as love. He was just sitting there, drinking his coffee. That was its own kind of thing. The hydraulic line was worse than Warren had let himself acknowledge. He found it mid-morning, Cole beside him with the work light angled into the engine bay. The seepage he'd monitored for a month had advanced to a slow but continuous weep, the fitting at the lower junction showing the crystallized residue of fluid that had been escaping for longer than a month, longer than 2 months. If he was honest, the kind of slow loss that happens when you are in the habit of deciding that monitoring is the same as addressing. He crouched in front of it for a long time. Cole crouched beside him. "How long?" Cole asked. "Long enough." Warren didn't look away from the fitting. "I should have replaced it in September." "Why didn't you?" Warren thought about the honest answer, which was that replacing it cost $240 for the line and fitting, and that $240 in September had felt like a number with weight to it, and that there was a particular kind of stubbornness that masquerades as practicality until something forces you to look at it directly. "I was monitoring it," he said. Cole said nothing. The barn was quiet around them. The cold concrete smell, the oil smell, the something underneath both. The work light threw its pale circle. Outside, the frozen fields ran to the tree line, and the tree line ran to the foothills, and the foothills lifted toward the Cascades, which this morning were showing snow on the upper ridges, the first serious snow of the year, white against the hard blue sky. "I'll call the parts supplier in Burlington," Warren said. "They'll have the fitting." "I'll drive," Cole said. Warren looked at his son. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." Cole stood up. "I want to." He brushed the concrete dust off his knees. "And on the way back, we're stopping at that diner in Cedro Woolley, because I haven't eaten since 6, and their pie is the only good thing about the drive up here." Warren stood up more slowly, his knees registering the cold and the crouch with their usual commentary. "Their pie is adequate," he said. "Their pie is excellent, and you know it." They drove to Burlington. Before they started on the hydraulic line, Cole picked up the manila folder from the kitchen table. Warren watched him. Cole opened it, read the offer sheet again, the number, the dealer's name, the description of the climate-controlled facility in Yakima. He read it the way he read things when he was making up his mind about something he had already decided, which was to say, he read it carefully and without hurry, and with the particular attention of a man closing a door he wanted to be sure he was closing completely. Then he folded it once and put it in his jacket pocket and looked at his father. "I'll recycle it at home," he said. "I don't want it in your house." Warren said nothing. He handed Cole the work light and they went out to the barn. The parts supplier was a man named Gerald Hofstetter, who had been running the same shop on the county highway since 1987, and who knew Warren the way small-town parts suppliers know their best customers, not intimately, but accurately. He found the fitting in the backstock without needing to look it up. He set it on the counter and looked at the worn end of the old line Warren had brought in and said been weeping a while without any judgment in it, and Warren said a while, and Gerald said the new line would hold another 20 years if Warren felt like keeping her going that long, and Warren said he intended to, and Gerald smiled the smile of a man who had heard this before from Warren and believed it. They stopped at the diner. The pie was excellent, and Warren knew it. He did not say this out loud, but he ate the whole slice, which said it for him, and Cole watched him eat it with an expression that was entirely his mother's, a particular quality of satisfaction that had nothing to do with being right about pie, and everything to do with something much larger that had been held in tension for a very long time and was cautiously beginning to release. On the drive back, with the Cascades going gold in the late afternoon light and the fields white and flat on either side, Cole said, "I've been thinking about what I said when I brought the offer up." He kept his eyes on the road. "I was thinking about the money and the roof and Dr. Haverford's bill, and I was trying to solve a problem. I wasn't thinking about what I was actually asking you to do." Warren looked out the passenger window. "You were thinking about your father," Warren said. "Yes, that's not wrong." "No, but it wasn't right either." Cole paused. "I was asking you to give up something that was keeping you—" He stopped, tried again. "You're still in conversation with him, with Grandpa Emile, every time you start that engine." He glanced at his father. "I was asking you to end the conversation." The road ran straight between the white fields. Warren thought about Emile's hands on this same steering wheel 50 years ago, about the way the key had felt warm from his father's skin the first time it was placed in his. "The conversation doesn't end," Warren said. "That's the thing about the right kind of inheritance." He paused. "It's not the machine. It's not even the knowing." He felt for the key through his jacket, the small, hard edge of it. "It's that he trusted me with the hard roads. And I trust you." Cole drove. The Cascades held their snow. The light went gold, and then amber, and then the long blue of a November dusk, and they came back to the farm track and up to the house and the barn, with its door and its work light, and Cole pulled in and set the parking brake, and they sat for a moment in the car in the dark. "Dead," Cole said. "I know," Warren said. They went inside and replaced the hydraulic line. The work took 2 hours, which was an hour longer than it would have taken Warren alone, and an hour shorter than it would have taken Cole alone, which meant together they were approximately right. Cole held the light and handed tools, and learned without being instructed the sequence of the work, the order in which things needed to be loosened and retightened, the amount of torque the old fittings wanted, the way the Diamond T had opinions about her own maintenance that you discovered by listening rather than forcing. At some point, Cole stopped asking questions and started anticipating. Hand before asked, light angled before Warren reached for it, the correct wrench already lifted from the box. Warren noticed this and said nothing. Some things you don't interrupt. When the line was replaced and the fitting was seated and torqued and the fluid topped off, Warren started the engine and ran it at idle for 10 minutes, watching the new fitting, watching the floor beneath the junction for any seepage. Nothing moved. The fitting was dry and clean and holding what it was supposed to hold. He shut her down. He put both hands on the steering wheel. "Good," he said. Cole, standing beside the cab, looked at his father's face in the work light, the lines of it, the stillness of it, the expression of a man who has done work he knows how to do and found it sound and thought about 40 years from now, and what it might mean to stand in a barn beside something his father had kept running, and whether he would know what to do. He thought he might. 3 months passed. Winter came properly, and then began in the tentative way of Skagit Valley winters to think about leaving. The Northfield fence held. The roof, which was the matter of a conversation Warren had quietly had with a contractor in January, was repaired. Dr. Haverford's bill was paid with the envelope from Mira Osgood and the rest from the seed catalog money Warren hadn't spent, and a calculation he'd made one evening about what things actually cost and what they were actually worth. Dusty Kraus called in February. He had, as he'd promised, found work boots that would last in drainage mud. He described them in some detail, as if this were a significant accomplishment, which Warren supposed it was. He drove up on a Saturday in early March, when the ground was thawing and the drainage was running, and the slopes of the foothills were beginning to show the first pale green underneath the brown. Warren took him out to the property edge where the ground changed composition and showed him how to read the soil, and then took him to the drainage ditch at the back of the north field where 3 different soil types met, and showed him that too. Kraus had a notebook. He wrote things down, but mostly he watched, and mostly he was quiet, and mostly he crouched in the cold mud and pressed his fingers into the ground the way Warren had showed him, and felt for what was there. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. The letter from the Washington State Heritage Equipment Register arrived on the last Thursday of March. Not the nomination letter that had come in November. This was the confirmation. Diamond T969, chassis number 47-CR-1104, had been formally entered into the register as a heritage equipment asset of regional historical significance. The letter included a certificate suitable for framing, which Warren sat on the counter and looked at without framing it, and a request for a photograph of the machine for the registry archive, which he fulfilled the following morning by bringing his old 35mm camera to the barn and taking 3 shots in the early light, the door open, the Diamond T standing in the barn the way she always stood. He sent the best one to Olympia. He sent a copy to Cole. He sent a copy to Petra, who was finishing her civil engineering degree in June. He sent a copy to Dusty Kraus without a note, which he thought would say enough. Cole brought Petra up in April on a Sunday, 3 weeks before her finals. She was 22 years old and had her grandmother's eyes and her grandfather's hands, and a way of walking into a problem from 3 angles simultaneously that Warren recognized as something that would serve her well or exhaust her, depending on the day. She had been in the barn before she'd grown up, knowing the diamond the way grandchildren know the specific geography of a grandparent's life, particular and present, without needing explanation. But she had not been in the barn since the recovery, since the registry letter, since whatever shift had occurred in the way Warren held the key. She walked around the machine slowly. She ran her hand along the boom. She looked at the winch drum and the cable and the rigging box, and at the red tape marking the 4-inch deformation in the cable that Warren had replaced in December when he replaced the hydraulic line, the red tape still wrapped around the old cable which he'd coiled and hung on the barn wall because he hadn't decided yet whether to keep it. "Tell me about the recovery," she said. Warren told her. He told it the way he told things, without embellishment, in sequence, with the specific details that mattered and without the ones that didn't. He told her about the soil at 14 inches and the anchor migration on fill and the cable geometry and the 47 minutes. He told her about Dusty Kraus and the wrong boots. He told her about Mira Osgood's notebook and the liability clause and the decision to sign anyway. Petra listened the way good engineers listen, with her whole attention, not filling in the pauses, letting the information settle before reaching for the next piece. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Grandpa Emile never met me," she said. "No, he died in 76. You weren't born until—" "I know, but—" She touched the side of the cab. "He kind of did, didn't he? Through this." She looked at Warren. "Through you." The barn was quiet. Warren looked at his granddaughter's hand on the cab, 22 years old, already calloused from fieldwork she'd done at the university's soil lab, the hands of a woman who was going to spend her life reading the ground. He reached inside his shirt. He pulled out the chain. He held the key in his palm, the worn metal the government stamped the new rawhide cord looped through beside the last thread of the old leather, the two of them together, the one that had begun to fail and the one that had not yet been tested. He held it out to Petra. She looked at it. She looked at him. "I'm not giving it to you," Warren said. "I need it back, but I want you to hold it for a minute." Petra took the key in both hands. She turned it over, read the government contract number, worn nearly smooth, touched the rawhide cord, then the frayed leather thread beside it. She was quiet for a long time. "She knows the hard roads," Warren said. "So do you." Petra looked up. Her eyes were bright in the barn light, and she did not look away, and she held the key with the careful attention of someone who understood that they were holding more than metal. Then she placed it back in her grandfather's palm. Warren closed his hand around it. He put the chain back over his head and felt the key settle against his chest, warm from her hands, now warm in the particular way of something passed between people who intend to keep passing it. This was the climax. Not the slope in November, not the cable under load, not the moment the caterpillar rolled onto flat ground. This, a barn in April, a granddaughter's hands a key that had been held by 4 people across 80 years and would be held by more. Warren understood this now. He had understood it for a while, if he was honest, since Cole's hands on the cable drum right to left without being asked, since Kraus in the drainage ditch with his notebook, since Emile's voice in the cab on every hard road Warren had ever taken. She knows the hard roads. So do you. It had never been about the machine. That evening, after Cole and Petra had driven back to Seattle, Warren went to the barn one last time. He did not go to start the engine or check the fittings or inspect the cable. He went the way you go to a place you have always gone, because it is the right place to be, at the end of a day when something has shifted, when something has settled, when the world has quietly rearranged itself into a configuration that feels against all probability like what it was supposed to be. He left the work light off. He left the barn door open. The April evening came in the smell of it, first cold water and thawing earth, and the distant green of the dug fir beginning to move again after the winter, the smell that is not spring exactly, but is the intention of spring, the ground remembering what it knows how to do. The last light came in behind it, the long horizontal light of an April evening in the Skagit Valley, gold going to rose, going to the deep blue that precedes the dark, and it fell across the barn floor and across the diamond tease hood and up the length of the boom, and the machine stood in it, the way old things stand in light, without apology, without explanation, simply present. Warren stood beside her. He put his hand on the hood. The metal was cold. In the field to the north, a red-tailed hawk was working the last of the light tilting on the updraft. above the frozen, thawed earth, reading the ground from above the way Warren read it from below. It called once that specific sound, half cry and half announcement, and then caught something in the grass at the field's edge and was gone. Warren reached inside his shirt. He pulled out the chain. He held the key in his open palm, not gripping it, just holding it, the worn metal lying there in the April light, warm from his skin, the government stamp a ghost of itself, the new rawhide cord beside the last thread of the old leather, both of them together, both of them holding. He looked at it for a long time. Then he set the key on the Diamond T's dashboard. Not permanently. He would take it back in a moment. He just wanted to see it there, where Emile had set it every morning before he climbed into the cab, where it had sat for 30 years, of hard roads and mountain logging and recoveries that no one else would attempt, where it had come to rest at the end of every day, before Emile took it back and put it in his pocket and walked to the house in the evening light. The key sat on the dashboard in the April dusk. It looked exactly right. It looked like something that had found its place. Warren stood in the barn and breathed the evening air and listened to the Skagit Valley settle into dark, the distant sound of the river, the creak of the dug fir in the light wind, the land doing what land does when the people on it are quiet enough to let it. He thought about all the hard roads. He thought about Emile. He thought some things are built for the worst conditions imaginable, and kept running for the day when those conditions return, and the keeping is the inheritance, not the machine, and the inheritance is not a burden, but a conversation, and the conversation does not end. He picked up the key. He put the chain back over his head. He closed the barn door, lifting at the bottom the familiar grind of metal on earth, the door swinging shut against the dark, and walked back to the house through the April evening, through the smell of thawing ground and cold water and coming green, and the light in the kitchen window was on, and the coffee from that morning was still warm enough, and Warren Dellacroix sat down at his kitchen table and was in the way of a man who has done what he was built to do and passed it forward to hands that will carry it further entirely and completely at peace. There are men who measure their lives in the things they keep running. Warren Dellacroix was one of them. And what he kept running was never only the machine. If someone in your life kept something going long after everyone else said to let it go, a skill, a tool, a way of doing things the hard way, because the hard way was the right way, tell us about it in the comments. Those stories deserve to be heard.